So usually when we think about building something really strong, right? Like we picture something totally impenetrable.
Yeah, like a modern bunker or something.
Exactly. Thick poured concrete, heavy steel doors, those massive titanium I-beams. I mean, the general philosophy for a long time has just been that to survive a chaotic world, you have to rigidly and aggressively resist it.
Right, because we basically engineer against failure by adding mass.
Mm-hmm.
We bolt things down, we weld joints together, we build thicker walls.
Yeah.
The whole assumption is that vulnerability comes from movement, right? And so invulnerability requires being completely uncompromising.
But today, we are tossing that entire premise completely out the window. We're jumping into a stack of incredibly fascinating sources today. Some structural engineering papers on historical architecture, translated texts on Zen philosophy, and these wild case studies of ancient Miyadaiku.
Which are the master carpenters of Japan, for those who might not know the term.
Right. And our mission for this deep dive is to explore this really profound paradox with you. How the creators of these ancient spaces achieved, like, profound mental expansion and literal indestructible physical strength, not by adding steel or concrete.
Yeah, but through relentless subtraction.
Exactly, just using raw nature, rocks, sand, meticulously carved wood, and somehow they outlast modern engineering.
It's wild because it requires a complete reversal of how we typically approach problem solving. Like, we have this massive bias toward addition.
Oh, total.
If a structure is weak, what do? We add brackets. If a room feels empty, we add decor. But the design philosophy detailed in these sources operates on the premise that true strength and true focus really are only revealed when you strip away everything that isn't absolutely essential.
Right, so let's ground this in a specific space so you can really picture it. Imagine you're sitting on the cool wooden veranda of a traditional Zen temple at night. You're leaving the day's chaos behind.
Just a completely tranquil space.
Yeah. And if you're standing there looking out into the courtyard, you're looking at a Karesansui, a dry landscape garden. Now, since we know you guys are already familiar with the basic visual of a Zen rock garden, let's bypass the basic aesthetics and look at the actual cognitive mechanisms at play here.
Because what you immediately notice is what's missing, right?
Yes. The severe lack of visual data.
Yeah.
There's no changing foliage, no bright colored flowers, literally zero water. Just unpolished rocks and a sea of perfectly raked white gravel.
Which is actually a highly engineered cognitive environment. I mean, think about it. When you look at a traditional Western garden, your visual cortex is just flooded with processing demands.
Like tracking moving leaves and stuff.
Exactly. Categorizing all the different colors, assessing if the plants are healthy or dying. The Karesansui completely removes that cognitive load. In Japanese aesthetics, this leans into the concept of yohakunobi, which is the beauty of blank space.
Yohakunobi tag. I love that.
By providing these highly specific geometric constraints like those perfectly placed asymmetric rocks and removing the noise of color and decay, your brain actually stops trying to process the biological reality of the garden.
And it starts processing spatial relationships instead, which basically forces the brain to shift from like passive observation to active generation.
Yes, because those rocks aren't just rocks anymore.
Right, your mind is forced to step in and assign scale to them. So a single jagged stone suddenly takes on the massive weight of a towering mountain. And that raked gravel, it becomes this infinitely flowing ocean. You are mentally constructing the landscape.
And that active construction is the entire point. The garden isn't just a pretty picture you look at, it's a tool you use.
A cognitive tool.
Exactly. But the visual element is really only half the equation here. The sources we're reviewing spend a significant amount of time on the physical mechanics of creating that space.
Right, the raking.
Yeah, maintaining the Karesansui is a core meditation practice called samu, which translates to mindfulness in everyday work.
And this is where the physical reality of the gravel really comes in, which I found fascinating. Because if there's no actual water, the act of raking it into ripples seems, I don't know, purely symbolic at first glance.
Right, like just a nice gesture.
But pulling a heavy wooden rake through dense, resistant gravel requires intense physical exertion. You're dragging these deep tines through crushed stone to create flawless concentric circles.
Or perfectly parallel lines, yeah.
Right, and that friction between the wood and the stone, it demands absolute unbroken concentration.
The neuroplasticity involved here is just incredible. When a monk engages in Samu, they're deliberately tying cognitive focus to a highly demanding physical action.
So there's no room for the mind to wander.
None.
Okay.
A single break in concentration translates immediately to a crooked line in the sand. Every single stroke is a deliberate sweep against resistance. So by the time that courtyard is completely raked, the monk has essentially used physical friction to grind away their own internal mental noise.
Wow. So the empty, perfectly ordered garden is really just the physical exhaust of that mental process.
That is a perfect way to put it.
Well, that friction is the perfect bridge to what is physically holding you up as you imagine looking out at this garden. Because the philosophy of using friction and raw materials doesn't stop at the edge of the sand. It is literally what is keeping the temple roof over your head.
Right, the transition from the psychological space of the garden to the physical engineering of the temple is seamless. It's the exact same philosophy applied to structural mechanics.
So let's look at the sensory reality of the structure itself. The text mentions the specific use of ancient hinoki wood, which is Japanese cypress.
Yeah, beautiful material.
And even after centuries, the floorboards have this incredibly smooth, almost silk-like texture. Plus, they continuously off-gas this faint, earthy fragrance. And I learned from the sources that it's not just for atmosphere. There's an actual biological mechanism happening there.
Oh, absolutely. Hinoki wood contains high levels of phytoncidas.
Phytoncidas.
Yeah. They're basically antimicrobial, volatile organic compounds that trees produce to protect themselves from rot and insects. And the crazy thing is, when humans inhale phytoncides, it triggers a measurable physiological response.
Like what?
It lowers your cortisol levels, reduces blood pressure, and actually calms the autonomic nervous system.
That's insane. So the architectural material itself is biochemically interacting with your body to force you to calm down.
Exactly.
It's literally a structurally load-bearing aromatherapy system.
That's exactly what it is. But the true engineering marvel here is how these massive hinoki logs are actually put together. I mean, we are talking about structures that are multiple stories high, supporting hundreds of thousands of pounds of heavy clay roof tiles.
Right.
And they do all of this without a single nail. No iron bolts, no metal brackets, literally no rigid fasteners of any kind.
Okay, wait. I have to push back on this on behalf of anyone listening who has ever built anything. How can a giant ancient temple hold together safely with absolutely zero nails or metal?
It sounds impossible, I know.
I mean, if you're supporting a multi-ton roof, how does a joint hold together purely by its own geometry? The text uses a jigsaw puzzle analogy, but if I pick up a jigsaw puzzle, it just falls apart in my hands. Gravity and sheer force would surely just rip these wooden beams out of their sockets, wouldn't they?
That's a fair point, but a jigsaw puzzle is two-dimensional, right? It relies on gravity resting it flat on a table. The ancient technique used here is called Kigumi, and Kigumi joints are three-dimensional, multi-axial locking mechanisms.
Okay, so a lot more complex than a puzzle piece.
Vastly more complex. Let's look at one specific joint mentioned in the engineering papers, the kanawatsugi, or the splice joint. The Miyadaiku carpenters meticulously carve an intricate locking mechanism. Think of it like a deeply angled, multi-tiered swallowtail right into the ends of two beams.
So they look like really complicated puzzle pieces.
Right. And when they slide together, they sit perfectly flush. But here's the absolute genius part. They drive a small wooden wedge, a locking pin, into a specifically designated gap right in the center of the joint. Okay.
So they are basically forcing a piece of wood into a space that's slightly too small for it.
Precisely. And driving that wedge forces the intricate carved faces of the beams to press outward against each other with immense pressure.
Oh, wow.
It creates massive internal friction. So you're taking the structural load and distributing it across the entire surface area of that complex geometric cut, rather than concentrating all the sheer force on the tiny, localized shaft of a single iron nail.
You are essentially weaponizing the wood's own internal pressure.
Yes.
Which makes sense because, I mean, wood is organic, it breathes, it responds to humidity. Metal doesn't do that at all.
Nope. Metal is completely static.
Right, so if you use a rigid iron nail over the decades, as the wood swells in the humid Japanese summers and shrinks in the dry winters, the wood is essentially crushing its own cellular structure against that unyielding metal nail.
Exactly. The hole widens over time.
The metal rusts, the hole gets loose, and eventually the joint just fails entirely.
And that is the fatal flaw of rigid fasteners. With Kigumi, because it's wood joined to wood, the entire structure reacts to the environment uniformly. When the humidity spikes, the wood cells absorb moisture and expand.
But they can't go anywhere because they're locked.
Right. Because they are locked in these complex geometric joints, the wood expands into itself. The joints actually grip each other tighter. The environmental stress literally makes the building stronger.
That is brilliant. But it does lead me to a hypothesis, or a question really. If the entire building is just wood resting against wood, held entirely by geometry and friction, wouldn't movement cause those joints to basically sand themselves down?
What do you mean?
Well, Japan is highly seismic, right? The ground moves constantly.
Yeah.
If the building sways during an earthquake and those joints rub against each other, wouldn't the sheer friction eventually turn those intricate locking mechanisms into sawdust, like causing the joint to just slip out?
It's a great question, and the answer comes down to the cellular structure of the hinoki wood itself, and specifically the direction of the grain. The master carpenters don't just carve shapes, they literally read the grain of the tree. They orient the joints so that the densest, most lignin-rich parts of the wood are the parts taking the friction.
Oh, so they're planning for the movement.
Exactly. Over time, the movement doesn't sand the wood away, it burnishes it. The microscopic cellular structure compresses and hardens at the exact points of friction.
Wow, so it gets smoother and harder.
Yeah, it creates this polished, incredibly dense interface that slides just enough to absorb energy without wearing away.
And that slight sliding is the key to everything when it comes to the seismic reality of building in Japan. Let's really dig into the earthquake physics outlined in these case studies, because this blew my mind.
It's amazing stuff.
When seismic waves travel through the earth, they carry a massive amount of kinetic energy. And if you hit a rigid structure, say a fixed stone and mortar wall or a modern steel-bolted frame, that energy has to go somewhere.
Right. A rigid structure attempts to reflect the seismic wave. It basically tries to stand perfectly still and force the earth to move around it.
Which is a bold strategy against a literal earthquake.
Very bold and often disastrous. Because kinetic energy doesn't just disappear. If the structure is entirely stiff, the high-frequency destructive energy is absorbed directly into the rigid materials.
And that's when things break.
Exactly. The mortar cracks. The iron bolts literally shear in half. The rigid object fails catastrophically simply because it cannot process the energy.
It's kind of like the difference between throwing a punch at a pane of glass versus throwing a punch at a heavy bag.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Right. The glass is rigid, so it shatters instantly.
Yeah.
But the heavy bag swings.
Yeah.
It absorbs and dissipates the kinetic energy of your fist into motion. So the Kigumi Temple is essentially a massive architectural heavy bag.
Yes. Or, to use a mechanical parallel, it acts like a complex array of shock absorbers. Because there are no rigid metal pins holding it together, the structure isn't a stiff box, it's an articulated skeleton.
So it can move.
Exactly. When the seismic wave hits the foundation, the entire building yields to it. The interlocking joints have these microscopic tolerances, like just fractions of a millimeter of give.
So as the wave travels up the massive pillars, those joints slip, and that internal friction we were talking about earlier goes to work.
Precisely. The friction converts the kinetic energy of the earthquake into a tiny amount of thermal energy. The building physically sways, undulating right along with the frequency of the earthquake.
That's incredible.
By swaying, it acts as a low-pass filter. It absorbs the sharp, destructive high-frequency shocks and turns them into a slow, rolling motion. It survives the violence because it dances with it.
And because the joints are geometrically locked, they don't fall apart.
Right. Once the shaking finally stops, gravity and the natural tension of the wood pull the entire structure right back to its precise center of gravity.
It's an engineering marvel that fundamentally redefines our entire concept of resilience. I mean, we usually operate on the assumption that to survive a shock, you must brace for impact. You lock your knees, tense your muscles, build a thicker wall.
But the Miyadaiku proved that ultimate resilience doesn't come from aggressive resistance at all. It comes from dynamic flexibility.
Right, like a martial artist. They don't take a throw by stiffening up, they roll into the fall to dissipate the energy.
And that structural philosophy translates directly back into the Zen concepts detailed in our philosophical sources.
How so?
Well, it's the idea that holding on too tightly or trying to aggressively conquer your environment is exactly what causes you to break. True strength is found in yielding, in interlocking seamlessly with others and your surroundings, and allowing the forces of the world to pass through you rather than trying to arrogantly block them.
Man, that is powerful. Which brings us to the final sensory element detailed in the sources. We have the visual emptiness of the garden clearing our cognitive load.
Yeah.
We have the tactile physical reality of the architecture safely absorbing the violent shocks of the earth.
Right.
But the auditory environment of this temple is where this whole philosophy of contrast really sharpens into focus.
Yeah, because you might assume that the goal of this highly curated meditative environment is absolute silence, the complete eradication of all sound.
Naturally, yeah. But absolute silence is actually biologically alarming to the human brain. If you ever sit in an anechoic chamber, those rooms engineered to absorb 100% of all sound, your brain actually starts frantically searching for auditory inputs.
It's super unsettling.
It really is. You start hearing the blood rushing in your own veins, the high-pitched hum of your own nervous system. Absolute silence doesn't feel peaceful to us. It feels oppressive. It's a sensory vacuum.
Which perfectly explains why the texts highlight a very specific auditory mechanism in these gardens, the shishiodoshi.
The bamboo water feature.
Exactly. It was actually originally designed as an agricultural tool to startle deer away from crops. It's basically a hollowed-out bamboo pipe balanced on a pivot. A slow trickle of water fills the top.
And then it tips.
Right. When the water shifts the center of gravity, the pipe tips forward, empties the water out, and then the heavy back end swings down to strike a stone base,
creating a sharp, loud, sudden clack, which on the surface makes absolutely no sense for a meditative environment. If the goal is tranquility, introducing a sudden percussive impact sounds incredibly disruptive.
Right.
It's the auditory equivalent of dropping a heavy textbook in a quiet library. Why does this sound actually make the environment feel more peaceful?
To understand why it works so well, we have to look at how the brain processes continuous stimuli. We experience something called auditory habituation.
Okay, what's that?
Well, when you sit in a quiet environment with only the soft sound of wind or a slow trickle of water, your brain quickly categorizes those sounds as non-threatening background noise, and it just filters them out.
You become numb to it.
Exactly. You become numb to the peace. And when that happens, your mind starts wandering. It drifts into anxiety about the future or rumination about the past.
The brain's audio buffer basically gets clogged with its own internal noise.
Yes. So the shishiodoshi acts as a system reset. That sudden rhythmic clack triggers a mild orienting reflex. It forces your auditory cortex to instantly snap back to the present physical reality of the veranda.
It resets the baseline.
Exactly. Think of it like adjusting the exposure on a camera. If the lens is open to a completely white, blank wall, it loses all depth perception.
Right.
The sudden sound provides a point of high contrast. When that sharp clack happens and the echo begins to fade into the trees, your brain measures the delta between that loud impact and the ambient environment.
Oh, wow. So the sound actually proves the silence.
Exactly.
It actively demonstrates to your nervous system how quiet the space really is by giving you a brief moment of loud contrast.
Yeah.
And because it's rhythmic, but slow enough that you can't perfectly predict when it's going to happen.
It keeps your brain anchored in the present moment. You are tethered to the physical world by a single, carefully engineered piece of bamboo.
Every single element we've analyzed today, from the rake in the sand to the wedge in the wood to the water in the bamboo, it's a total masterclass in harnessing natural forces rather than fighting them.
It really is. It's an entire system built on the premise that subtraction and flexibility yield far greater results than addition and rigidity.
So let's tie all of this together for you guys listening. The sources we've unpacked today present this beautifully unified theory of design that works equally well for structural engineering and human psychology.
Absolutely.
The Karesansui garden clears the cognitive load by removing the noise of color and decay, using the friction of the rake to physically manifest a quiet mind. And then the Kigumi architecture secures your physical body by removing rigid iron, relying on the friction of complex geometries to dance with the violent kinetic energy of the earth rather than fighting it.
And the sudden strike of the shishiodoshi uses auditory contrast to actively deepen the silence, preventing your mind from drifting away into anxiety.
The overarching lesson here is that true durability is dynamic. The ancient builders recognized that attempting to aggressively lock the world into a static state is just a fool's errand.
But the implications of this ancient philosophy are definitely not confined to historical Japanese temples.
No, they aren't. And this is the provocative thought we want to leave you with today to sort of mull over on your own. We've spent this entire deep dive looking backward at historical carpenters, but modern engineers are actually currently looking at these exact same principles to solve the problems of the future.
Yeah, if you look at the cutting edge of aerospace engineering, researchers at agencies like NASA and JXA are actively studying Kigumi interlocking geometries for spacecraft and satellite construction.
Wait, really? For space stations?
Yes. Because in the extreme environment of outer space, temperatures fluctuate wildly. If you weld a rigid metal frame together, the massive thermal expansion and contraction can literally warp and tear the rigid joints apart.
But if you use complex, interlocking geometric joints inspired by ancient woodworkers, the spacecraft's frame can essentially breathe.
Exactly. The joints can absorb the thermal expansion without shearing, allowing the structure to safely expand and contract in the vacuum of space.
That is mind-blowing. The exact same principle of yielding to violent forces that kept a wooden temple standing through a 12th century earthquake might be exactly what keeps a space station intact in the 21st century.
It's amazing, and it really forces us to ask a crucial question about our own personal approaches. If ancient builders discovered that removing rigid fasteners actually made a massive structure more resilient to shocks, and removing clutter made a garden more mentally expansive, where in your own life are you trying to hold things together with rigid, unyielding force? And how much stronger might you be if you stopped trying to aggressively fight the friction and instead learned to simply yield and flex?
It turns out, whether you're dealing with seismic waves, the vacuum of space, or just the overwhelming noise of modern life, the most resilient structure isn't the one that refuses to move. It's the one that knows exactly how to yield. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Have a good, peaceful night, and we'll catch you on the next one.